In talking about law today, Judge Arung took a significant legal step in 2013 with the traditional owner settlement agreement that was made. Also acknowledging the tens of thousands of years of sovereignty of country as First Nations people. So as Karen said, I'll be chairing today, and I'm really pleased to be able to have the opportunity to chair this session. And I've been associated with the PPI for about 18 months. And I'm a researcher and educator with an environmental education background. This seminar series has been inspiring, and today will be too. We have been exploring what location means, you know, as a public pedagogy, or get public out, in many different and diverse ways. Today, we are treated to a presentation by Peter Alsen on the topic locations of law or non-law. Peter is a PhD candidate and research assistant at the School of Education, Deakin University, a former early childhood educator. His doctoral research focuses on the intersection of politics, law and education, entitled Early Childhood Education and Care in Australia and Germany, a study in the intersection of education and the rights of the child. Peter holds a master's degree in political science, law and psychology, with a published monograph in the field of critical legal studies entitled Human Rights Between Universalism and Particularism in German. One of Peter's major research interests is human rights and their transfer and implementation into everyday life, such as social inclusion, equality, individual freedom and political participation. Other areas of concentration are critical legal studies, human social environments, social pedagogical approaches, various forms of learning, and the concept of public pedagogy and its effects on individuals and society. Peter aims to critically re-examine current societal and political environments and to contribute to new ideas and concepts of change. So with that, and I think we're in for a probing of law in those intersections of social justice and critique. And I'll hand it over to Peter now to commence the seminar. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you very much. So what I will do first is I will share my screen with you. I have 15 slides, and I hope you can see it now. So locations of law or non-law. When I thought about to hand in the paper from this year's conference, I thought, how can I combine, or how can I talk about something that is related to law and location? I thought for quite a while, and then I thought, law is a means of certain people, like political elites or societal elites, who use law to lead people, to govern people, or to do something with them or for them or on behalf of them. And then I thought, where am I? I'm living here in Australia. I live in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. And then I thought, hang on, there is a lot of influence of where I live. So if I had lived in Vietnam, for instance, I would have had a quite different experience of life. If I had lived in the western suburbs of Melbourne, I would have had another set of conditions that would have shaped my life as well. So I'm here now in the eastern suburbs, which are meant to be of higher quality of life, whatever that means. So I will go one slide further. What am I presenting today is work in progress. And the work in progress means I'm still thinking about all these different topics I just mentioned very briefly. And presenting work in progress can be a little bit of a problem, because some people might think, oh, that's not really well considered. There is a lack of theory, there is a lack of something else. So when I talk to you today, it is still work in progress, and I'm happy to be critiqued. In fact, that is what I'm aiming for today. I want you to think about what I tell you, and I expect you to say, hang on, that is a good idea, but. Or if you said, I can't really agree with it because. So I encourage you really to tell me what you think, and I would wish that we could have a good discussion even when I talk. So I will talk for about 30 minutes. Then we will have a breakout room time for about 20 minutes. Then we will come together again for another 15, 20 minutes, and then we will have a second breakout. And after that, we will have time to share our experiences. But again, what I really want is, yeah, if you need to ask something, or if you would like to add something to our conversation right now, then raise your hand and interrupt me. I'm really keen to do it that way, because sometimes you can't remember your question after 20 minutes. That's at least how I work. So please be encouraged to interrupt me anytime, because I want us to have a very good time with sharing ideas and understanding what I would like to tell you, and I want to understand what you want to tell me. Okay, I want to connect public pedagogies, the idea of location, and the construct of law. And I want to describe effects of locations on people. I have 4 statements, which are locations are political spaces with effects on its residents. I claim that all locations are public. Political and societal elites determine inter-societal processes. And the last statement, learning is political and occurs in various locations with intended and unintended outcomes. How do I back up my statements? I will use the concepts of public pedagogies, the concept of socialization, and the notion or the concept of socio-legal studies. I want to come back to locations, our political spaces. We are here in Melbourne, and you will have heard about the Ring of Steel, which was laid around Melbourne to protect regional Victoria from Melburnians. That notion that has been made by the Premier defines the political space. Why? In Melbourne were employed different sets of rules than in regional Victoria. That makes it political because we couldn't move as we were used to doing. And it was based on a legal assumption that the space around Melbourne and the space beyond Melbourne has to be protected. and it was based on political directives. All locations are public because law and governments can tell us what we can do in our house. And it is now, after our experiences, very easy to explain that even public spaces, even private spaces are public. The reason law can tell us what we can do or can't do. And who tells us what to do? Well, that is the political elite which was voted in, but it is still an elite that tells us how we have to behave. And that is what I call intra-societal process. We behave as we are meant to behave. And how do we do that? Why do we do certain things we do? Because we have learned that we should follow certain directives. Learning is political, or as Paulo Freire said, that education is political. And it is because two elite groups tell us what to do, and there are intended and unintended outcomes. The intended outcomes are you have to do what we say, and the unintended outcomes are that people sometimes don't do what they were meant to do. I will go one slide further. Locations of law and non-law. 2 weeks ago, I said in one of the times when we were able to discuss and talk, I mentioned that the high-rise buildings you can see on the screen right now were places where people had to stay inside, public housing estates. Public housing is under public law, and the government can say to the people what they have to do or not. Is that a location of law or non-law? Please decide yourself what it is in your opinion. And again, locations of law and non-law. You can see these two red parts on that map. These two red parts in that map are the high-rise buildings you were able to see just then. These places are supposed to be of disadvantage by the definition of the government. Why are they meant to be places of disadvantage? Mainly because there are people of low income. You can see the other colors, and they are defined as places of less disadvantaged or more advantaged. What about the effects of law on people? Public housing estates are places which can't be chosen by people who live there. They might have applied, or they will have applied for public housing, and they are aware of that, but they are not able to choose where they want to live. Disadvantage or advantage? What are the effects of law, of that kind of law, on the people who live there? When I came to Australia about 10, 11 years ago, that was the very first quite challenging experience I had. I saw these high-rise buildings, very often positioned at freeways, train lines, in between train lines and freeways. Places which don't look very nice. In fact, noisy, lots of pollution. The effects of law on people who live there are not very nice. What do they have experienced a few months ago? They were locked in, which was based on a legal directive. Please keep this map in mind for a few moments and think about it. Let's think about our privilege of the place we live. I live in a place that is surrounded by green, big, large backyards, no noise, less pollution, friendly people who don't mistrust me. Last year, I lived close to these public housing estates in North Melbourne, and I could sense and feel the disdain of people who watched people from public housing high-rises. I saw and could feel the disdain of so-called people of advantage, how they looked down on them. I had to ask myself, do I want that? And what do I do to make a change? And I have to admit, it is a hard task. But I'm not free to leave it as it is. Now you could ask me, why do I have to do something? And of course, that is a very moral question, but I have to answer that. I have to answer that because I am living in this place. I am a fellow resident, and everyone should expect from everyone to work together. Because we live in one society, not in many or not in plenty. How do I connect public pedagogies, law, and location? I talked about three concepts. The first is public pedagogy, and it is defined as a theoretical concept focusing on forms, processes, and sites of education and learning occurring beyond formal schooling and practices. Socialization is a process that makes social beings the true social actors, and this process includes learning of skills, habits, knowledge, motivations, and identities that enables us to interact with the social environment. Law is a body of rules aiming at the prevention of the orderly settlement of conflicts. Let's go further. Today, we will look at locations. We will look at a prison. We will look at neighborhood. And we will have a broader look into country. We will think about agents. Agents are a term in socialization. And agents are the people who make us learn something. Parents are the first type of people who can teach their children. The government is another entity of the public. They are also agents because they teach us what to do by all sorts of means, by law, by political directives, by government documents, by buildings, like high-rise buildings. Agents are courts to make judgments about our behavior, which could put us into prison. Agents are police who tell us what we have to do. There are also social actors, and these actors are children, young people, and adults. Subjects that tell us or teach us what to do are social norms, societal expectations, and identity. We will come to these terms in a while. What are the outcomes? I can tighten it up a bit more. The government wants us to behave in their ways. And they would argue we have law and we want you to comply with that. Meaning, they want us to take a certain role or position in society. They tell us how to achieve a certain lifestyle. The government tells us to take some kind of education. They tell us how they want me to behave in terms of employment and work. And there are many more outcomes the government, for instance, wants to achieve. When I think of parents, they have another set of outcomes. They want perhaps their child to achieve a better life. We have to talk about what that means. Parents want their children to achieve better in educational terms. They want us to strive and to achieve more. But there might also be other outcomes. Governments don't care. Courts make wrong decisions. Police, in terms of outcomes, does also sometimes choose wrong means. So there's a whole set of outcomes that are related to legal norms and to expectations of parents and governments and courts and police. But what about the social actors, children and youth and adults? What do they expect from their location and from law? Children and families as a location, they want loving parents. Young people expect to grow and to make their own experiences, and especially against their parents' recommendation or advice. And adults want to do what they want. They have outcomes in mind that may not comply with other people's ideas or government ideas. Subjects such as social norms and expectations are another set of thoughts which are also targets of law and educational processes. Social norms are defined by government expectations. They push us a little bit into certain directions. Think about the most recent poll in terms of sexual orientations and how people want to live. Government social norms are now questioned. It is not anymore about binary partnerships. Societal expectations are changing as well. 50 years ago, women were meant to stay at home, but now they are free, not always, to do what they want. And that is where we have to look at law and say, what does law to people? And what does a location, like a household, does to someone who was bound to stay at home? We talked about it a little bit before. I was talking about agents and about what makes us do certain things. Agents are, like I said before, governments, parents, courts, and so on. And when I put that into a public pedagogy perspective, it is about where is education located. Government agents position their type of education into the public space. In fact, they position it around themselves. Political government agents are an entity beyond formal schooling and practices. For that reason, when I think about law and connecting to public pedagogies, agents like governments act beyond formal schooling and practices. So they should be included into the concept of public pedagogy. I claim that not only people who are considered to be educators are comply with that definition. I state that also government agents should be included into public pedagogy. Sites of education, social environments like public housing estates, like inner city Melbourne, regional Victoria, and other places we can imagine, like Australia as a whole, states as part of one whole. And we have social actors. They are, depending on the idea of the government, either included in one set of location, like society, or state, or inner city Melbourne. There are people on the fringes or outside. And now I'm talking about location in another sense, not physically, but in the sense of a metaphor, if you like. If I don't meet governments or any other agents' definition of identity, ideology, values, or motivations or norms, then I'm outside that social environment. And it became clear what it means if you are not inside that social environment. You are looked at like someone who has done something wrong, like living in a public housing estate. And assumptions why people live in public housing estates they haven't tried enough, they might be lazy, they might not share our values, and therefore they are outside of a social environment or a certain defined location. Now I want to try to combine the concept of socialization with my statements. Socialization is a process that makes social beings the true social actors. This process includes learning of skills, habits, knowledge, motivations, and identities that enables us to interact with the social environment. My question is now, how can people who are outside a social environment interact with people inside? And especially then, when they are not invited to interact or prohibited to interact. Socialization is a concept that is used in developmental psychology, and it is about children who learn when they are young, when they grow up, and what is needed to progress in their lives. So it is about learning, and as I claimed before, law affects people's lives. And now when children can't attend early childcare centers, because it is too expensive? How can they learn skills or habits, or how can they learn other things? How can they be supported by developing motivation and their identity? How can they develop their identity if agents like governments, early childcare centers are not open to give them freedom to develop identities as they want? One keyword is transgender. How is that supported in childcare centers? How is that supported by law? And how is that supported by the society? How can everyone be included into one social environment? You can see that arrow from the left to the right. Agents, ideologies, values, motivations, norms, and identities of government agents inform and affect locations, social environments, and social actors. I claim if ideologies, values, identities of agents, motivations, and norms were different, social environments and social actors would develop and grow differently. What is the socialization process about? I had two ideas. When I think of government or social or political elites, they might think it is about power, because I want people to do what I want. Bertrand Russell gave a very interesting definition of power. He says power is the production of attended effects. Robert A. Dahl said about 20 years after Bertrand Russell, he said, A has power over B to the extent that he can get B to do something B would not do otherwise. That is a very interesting definition, isn't it? Then I thought, maybe socialization is not about power. Maybe it's more about doing the right thing. I can imagine thinking, I heard that all the time for the last 4 or 5 months, doing the right thing, being compliant. And in fact, there was a political scientist in the 60s, David Easton. He said, compliance can be defined as relative frequency of acceptance of political authorities' decisions as authoritative or binding by the bulk of society. Okay, what the government wants us to do? Does they want us to be compliant and to accept their power? Let's think about that. Keep that in mind, because that could be something you can talk in your breakout groups. And here we are. It is time for the first breakout session. Reasons for a new way to learn and to teach. And that can be applied to any kind of agent. Could be the government, could be parents, could be you in your educational role, or in any other work relationship you have. Fiske defined, he gave a reason, and he said knowledge is never neutral and it never exists in an empiricist objective relationship to the real. Knowledge is power, and the circulation of knowledge is part of the social distribution of power. Now, what I want you to think about in the breakout time is, what does, in your opinion, the government wants us to be? Another question, who do I want to be, despite government expectations, or despite other people who tell me you should be this or that? And thirdly, please think about, what should the country I live in look like? So think about social norms or legal norms, and think about what, in your opinion, should be changed or should be somehow different. And it can be anything. And when you talk in your group, please think about critically. And in fact, if you can't agree with my statements, please don't, and tell me that. That is the first step to make law and society work. Being compliant with law doesn't mean that you shouldn't criticize it. In fact, law needs to be criticized because it is almost never just. You may think that's quite interesting that a lawyer says that, but law only works if you can heavily critique it. Okay, I will put these 3 questions into the chat so that you can read it again and so that you can have something to think about.
Homogenized, and that I want to be, talking about being, I guess, that whole idea of plurality and difference and being able to come together on our differences. And I was talking about quiet activism as well, and we were talking a little bit about hope and about things that we need, what do we need? I guess this was talking about what should the country that I live in look like, but talking about those sorts of things as well. So was there anything else to add from my group? Erin? Oh yeah, did I cover everything? There you go.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other thoughts or ideas?
I might talk about my group. Lovely Janelle and Janet, thank you. We had a lovely conversation. And because the US election thing is going on, it's kind of front of mind. So we had this kind of interesting conversation that got to guns for some reason. So that was interesting. So it's kind of interesting in a way to talk about these 2 societies and the kind of the different sets of value systems and then how that impacts how we each live our lives in different locations. So that was interesting. And so we talked about values and about how that governments, parties hold a set of values, and that impacts the laws or policies that they kind of follow or impose on people, and then we got to talk about our local kind of situation where sometimes where there is agreement with you know, with the community, within the community, and then there's not agreement. And so we kind of, I couldn't think of the word because I'm really tired, Peter, but you use the word compliance, and it's got a bit of a tone about that is a forcing of power, you know, and also your Dahl question about, you know, A does B and forces B to do something. But sometimes that's denying B has an active sense of agency and actually might want to cede, you know, and do something because it's in their interest, you know. So there's something there not about compliance, but it's about the choice to comply or to go along with the policy or the law or whatever. And COVID, of course, was something we talked about because, you know, 100 days in lockdown here in Melbourne, you know, the rest of the world goes, oh my God. I've actually found it, I mean, it's been hard, no question, but, you know, I've been generally compliant because I see an interest in there for myself, around my health and others' health and well-being. So there's a sense of agreement around those laws and restrictions. There's others who disagree with me and think it's a conspiracy and blah, blah. You know, but also COVID, I mean, anyway, that's that question. But we also talked about patriarchy, talking about values and patriarchy, you know, and where laws are made and it's shaped by a set of patriarchal values and how that has privilege for some and not privilege for others, and at that high kind of structural level. And then we went down into the really intimate kind of neighbourhood level, and there's different kinds of how restrictions and how the law and power plays out is very different, actually. Yeah, and there's a lot more mutuality there. Anyway, that was our conversation. There were other things because we had a great time, actually.
Okay, fantastic. Any other voices? Okay, good. So then I will continue. And I can tell you there will be another breakout time in a short while, but I will share my screen again with you. Okay, good. So we had talked about that. Thank you so much for your input. Now I would like to continue. And now it is about the last concept of law. And you already thought about it and talked about it. I want to repeat it again for a minute. Law is a body of rules aiming at the prevention of the orderly settlement of conflicts. When I heard about that, that assumes quite a bit. So it assumes that law only applies or get interaction when there is a conflict, and that law is only there to prevent something like that. So how does it, how can I connect that to public pedagogy and location? And that is quite hard, but I found a few examples where it might be possible to think about it a little bit further and to make some sense of that. So it is about locations of law and non-law. And you will see 3 cases of locations. And my main idea is, firstly, when I look at that first one here, prison, how does it look like visually? But even more important, what does it with people who are in these prisons? And what do they learn if they are inside? And what do we learn for ourselves when we look at these image here and the two others that will follow in a minute. My idea of public pedagogy was and still is that we as a society learn from looking at that image, and that the people who are inside in prison learn as well. Now I want you to think about, what does it do with you when you look at that prison cell and that whole hallway, doors, colors, numbers, how it looks like. So image number 2, we looked at that before. What does it do with you when you look at that? So I can tell you how I feel about that. I feel ashamed. I feel ashamed because people live in these small areas, these little apartments close to freeway. No motivation, perhaps to look out of the window, no motivation to share time with other people. But it also tells me, makes me ashamed, because governments seem to be okay with it to put people into these buildings. What do I learn from the government and government officials, from law, how they think about people? Is it a humane way to live? And as I said before, location has an impact on my development and my striving and my very private development of ideas. So I could claim that people who live in these areas don't share very many values that the government has. In fact, they would become angry of the government, and from a very personal point of view, they are correct. I know that is very unscientific, but I still want to say that it is understandable that people don't want to live in these buildings, that they are angry. And that is, in fact, a very legal sociology-like kind of approach to take into account when a law is made, how people might think about it and how they proceed from that point of view. Another last thought. They are forced into certain ways of thinking. Last location, the country. I think you might have expected something totally different, but I still like that image. When I look at it, it tells me that expanding into outer areas of Melbourne, it is important to have streets, to have a car, to have a shopping center. Where do I find a childcare center? Do I see a park or a playground in that image? Do I see people walking around? What kind of impact and effects have locations like these 3 on people? It is now time for another breakout. I would like to think about how can education initiate change. That is why I'm here. I'm here as a legal scholar, as a social science scholar and an educationist. I'm here to initiate change. The society should become aware of inequality. Law and people who make law should become aware that they also can push for disadvantage. And political elites could or should become aware of their power. What I want you to do now is to do visual analysis of these three images. What I mean with that is, please look at these images and think about what they teach you. Like, what do they teach you to think about your surroundings, about certain areas, like the prison cell, and how to think about your neighborhood? What are the impacts of neighborhoods on people and on you?
I'll share something, Peter.
Yeah, great, fantastic.
Our group talked, and jump in the lovely Erin. We had two people, and Janelle again, and Liesl. We had a great conversation, very free-ranging, but we got back to the point. And a really core part of our conversation was about values and ethics. And in that exchange of in education, whether it's formal or informal, or parent's child, auntie, in fact, to niece. So we talked about the complexities of social relations, whether it's from the law and from elite kind of governance structures through to ordinary relations within families or in socialisation processes. So that, ethics and values came up a lot.
Fantastic.
And I had a good book recommendation. Thank you, Liesl. Thank you, it was good.
Thank you. Okay, good. So I will share my screen again, and then we will have the last slide and the last discussion. So we have talked about law, and we have talked about location and public pedagogies and learning, socialization, and impacts on people in general. We need to talk about what do we do with law. And right at the beginning, I said that critiquing law is good and it is a must, because law is not just. Now, the final topic is, so what do we do with that? We are aware of that. We know that law is not always just. We know about disadvantage, discrimination, about restriction that are not good for people. We also know that we live on a land without permission. We know that there are people who claim it is their land. We were colonizers, our ancestors were. And what do we do with that? It sounds, as everyone, decolonization. But what does it mean to decolonize law? What needs to be done? What are your ideas and what are your strong recommendations to you and me and to the government. I would like to open up a discussion for about 10 minutes until 12:30. I know it is only very briefly, but maybe we can get a few leading and very important ideas. So it's up for discussion.
I was just going to say something about so I work in community development space and community leadership, and supporting people to become active citizens. Yeah. So, and I'll tell you that most people actually have very rudimentary or very poor understanding of our governance structures, yeah, and how it kind of works and how you can connect with it. Someone mentioned complacency before in their conversation. I've written the word down. So there's something, you know, we're meant to be a democracy. You know, it'd be nice if we were a participatory democracy a wee bit more rather than turning up every 4 years to vote. You know, it's democracy, and participatory democracy is more than that, yeah? Yet we have poor knowledge, unless we are affected negatively by it, and then sometimes there's the activism around changing kind of laws, and that's movements change laws in a way, unless you're an elite and you get in and you're part of that kind of elite group that works in that space. Anyway, sorry, I'm just posing this. I think people, how do we decolonise it when we kind of don't know it or so passive or complacent? Anyway, it's a thought. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you very much.
I just wanted to mention something that came up in our chat as well, and I think it's a really big question that you've asked, Peter, and it's almost like, you know, shifted from what we've been talking about for the day, and it's huge to ask it at this point, but yeah. But it does come back to my comment and what we spoke about. So I put in the chat earlier when you put up the third image and you titled it with country, and my question was, which country? You know, how are you using the word country? And that challenged me, and it challenged a couple of the others of us in there as well. And I think that the conversation about decolonisation is probably a really big one to have, particularly when three of us in our group saw the word, even just that, you know, just the language of country in three different ways. And particularly, you know, to link those two things together, it's a really big thing. And it's basically, you know, the other thing that we were talking about was difference and needing diverse points of view. And you asked the question when you sent us into the groups, which was, how can education initiate change? And I think we answered that question by saying we need diverse points of view, interdisciplinary thought and critical conversations. And I wrote down sparked by photos, because what looking at those photos did actually sparked that, and, you know, sent our brains off in all different areas about that. So maybe I'm not really 100% sure whether that's an answer or another question, but maybe just to, you know, think about where we're coming from when we use particular language, and what that might actually spark for people, which is a good thing. It gets us thinking about things from different perspectives.
Thank you.
Peter, any closing comments from you before we wrap up?
Yes, I want to thank you for listening, for my challenges, in particular about country and land. Thank you very much. I imagine that it was perhaps not always easy to understand. What I wanted is, I want to bring in ideas where we can connect different areas, like how to think about government, about elites, about education, and about how we are and where we live. And yeah, so again, thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions in forms of emails or yeah, any other way. And thank you again.
Yeah, thanks very much, Peter, on behalf of everyone. And thanks to the group too for your participation today. Very thought-provoking. And you elucidated some really interesting elements in that complex arrangement, Peter, that I think all of us can take away and think through and talk through more. So thank you very much. I'll pass over to Karen now.
Yeah, well done, Peter.
Yeah. Thank you.